Hello, and welcome to the 8:30 Live. I think YouTube's still catching up. All right. Oh, there we go. Okay, so hello and welcome to the 8:30 Live. Fireplace is going. It's Monday. I hope everybody had a great weekend. I'm feeling pretty good. I was like under the weather this weekend, but now I feel much better. I went shopping. There was a shortage at the supermarket. So then I went to another supermarket and there was still a shortage of things that I wanted. So yeah, coronavirus definitely taking its toll. Supply lines are frayed, which is making me a little unhappy. As it turns out as well, you won't be able to buy a bicycle anytime soon because bikes are in such super high demand. Presumably, as the world collapses and petrol becomes completely inaccessible. Now, it's because the weather's prime, people don't want to take the subway. City Bike's been working out pretty well for me, but I am kind of nervous about this whole can't get a bike thing. That's never happened before. But whatever. In any event, thanks for tuning in today. Let me get the sharing. Oh, people are jumping in already? Oh, boy. Okay. We might as well just get to it. All right. What do we have today? Oh, let's start with some of the life fare. This came up yesterday. I thought it was really hilarious. So I'm going to share it with you all, which is that apparently Fox News, Fox Business put out an article that there are 1.6 trillion in outstanding Chinese bonds that Donald Trump could use as leverage over China to fund them, which is absolutely hilarious. Because I just want to tell you about these bonds for a second. This is 1.6 billion. Sorry, not billion, trillion. 1.6 trillion in Chinese bonds. That's definitely true. But the bonds come from 100 years ago, in the 1920s, when China was governed by the Republic of China. Not the People's Republic of China, but the Republic of China, which was the democratic attempt after the fall of the Qing Empire. So this legitimately is a debt from 100 years ago owed by another government not currently in power. And there is an international sort of law that it is understood in international law, rather, that successor governments are responsible for the prior government's debt. But there's this notion of odious debt, which is that an illegitimate government's debt is not transferable to a successor government. And perhaps the best example of this is 100 years prior to the loans taken out by the Republic of China to fight the PRC in China's civil war. The United States passed the 14th Amendment, which obviated the debt of the Confederacy. So in fighting the American Civil War, the Confederates took out lots of loans to fight the Union. And when it was all over, the Union basically said, no debt shall be assumed by any state or by the federal government to pay off money that the Confederate owed, that the Confederacy owed. So I believe the language is something along the lines of no money or debt shall be assumed. No debt shall be assumed by any state or by the federal government that was used to fund insurrection or rebellion against the Union. So the United States has already set the precedent of an illegitimate government defeating in the Civil War that doesn't pay back lots and lots of debt incurred in that war. So I'd love to see Donald Trump try and exercise this claim to $1.6 trillion owed by the Republic of China to creditors in the United States, particularly, because I just can't understand why Fox News would even print this article. Fox News is trash, but the idea that they would this is just such nonsense. The idea that they would come up with this and be like, oh, this is a leverage point for Donald Trump. My God, what is going on in the world where this A is news and B, I bet there's going to be people out there on the right. This is going to make the rounds. And then people are going to start clamoring about this $1.6 trillion that China owes America. And they're legitimately going to think that China should be paying us back and that we should be like imposing tariffs and going to war over this humongous debt that China owes the United States. That's never been spoken of before because, I don't know, globalists have run the economy, which has been selling American interests to China for 100 years. Just, my God, what a ridiculous situation. But in any event, I just wanted to start off with that because it's some hilarious light fare. And, there's all sorts of other more serious fare to get into. But there is one more amusing debunking to do. You know, these things are out there. Yeah, the right wing with all of its conspiracy theories. It's so funny. In any event, there are apparently, I didn't know this, but this apparently became such a thing that it warranted a news article about it. I didn't see this, but apparently people were saying that the $1 trillion stimulus package, the $3 trillion stimulus package that Congress passed, or I should say that the House passed unilaterally. The third, depends how you count. I would say second stimulus bill. Some people are saying that the second stimulus bill was the extension of the Paycheck Protection Program. That's not a real stimulus bill. So the second $3 trillion stimulus bill that the House Democrats came up with and passed unicamerally. Apparently there was like a rumor circulating that it put Congress into recess until July, and then conservatives were flipping out that the Democratic House would pass this major bill and then give themselves a gigantic vacation for like 2 months. If you hear that, and again, this lie warranted its own news story. Apparently, if you hear that, that's not true. The bill included language allowing the Speaker of the House to adjourn Congress until the date which Congress decides to reconvene, which is normal. Totally normal. It's like in every bill. And so that was, I don't know, taken out of context or just contorted to give the impression that the Democratic Congress is lazy and was going on vacation for 2 months. Absolutely not the case. It was a regular bill with regular clauses about the adjournment of the House. So just know that first, the conservatives were screaming about the Democratic House is trying to help us, but they're lazy and going on vacation. And now, literally, they're just screaming about, oh, they tried to help us, these bastards. I can't get enough of these folks. I got to say, Donald Trump, to me, just when he talks and opens his mouth, he's the funniest guy. And just the tangents he goes on, I'm going to miss him when he's gone. I feel like, you have all of these comedians and they do their Trump impressions and they kind of nail the inflections and they kind of nail the voice, but nobody nails his amazing tangents, which just go on. He's got a topic and then he's on another, and as he's explaining the topic, he's on another topic. And from there, another topic. And there's just this winding monologue of his train of thought, which you can't keep focused on any one thing. And that's what I'm going to miss the most when Trump's no longer in office. But hopefully they can run a live stream 24 hours from his jail cell where he'll be presumably talking to himself in the same fashion. And I can get my fix that way. Okay. Speaking of things that Trump said, he did make a major announcement today. That announcement being that he is taking hydroxychloroquine to prevent the coronavirus because now the disease has infiltrated the White House. So you've got a lot of convergences here. First, the first component is Donald Trump is obviously very concerned about catching the coronavirus. He doesn't want it, which speaks to all of his rhetoric about how it's no worse than the flu and how it's going to magically disappear. We'll get to that in a second. But Donald Trump has now said that as a preventative measure, he's taking hydroxychloroquine. So, just to reiterate what we said before, in trials, hydroxychloroquine has not been proven to be an effective preventative measure, prophylactic, or treatment for the coronavirus. In fact, the only thing it's really known to do when applied as a mitigation effort for the coronavirus is cause heart palpitations and arrhythmia, which can lead to a heart attack, which can kill you. So I honestly, I don't know. I'd love to hear what other people think, but I honestly don't know whether or not to believe Trump that he's taking hydroxychloroquine. I think there's a real shot, like at least 50-50, that he is saying he's taking hydroxychloroquine because he is too stubborn to back down from his initial statement that hydroxychloroquine is good for dealing with the virus. And now that the virus has infiltrated the White House, can't bring himself to say he's not doing something proactive, because he's always got to have a solution to something that makes him the best. Now, I mean, obviously a lot of people have been joking about how he should be trying to drink Clorox and such, but I don't know. The next thing you know, he'll be saying that he's bombarding himself with intense amounts of light to get it under his skin, and that's why he has such a gorgeous complexion. And he's always believed in sunlight, which is why he's had a tan this entire time while he's been in office. Obvious lines of where the makeup ends aside. Now, I did say we were going to get into one other thing, which I mentioned, but now I completely forgot what it was that I had referenced. So whatever, let's just press on. Donald Trump is really an amazing individual, though, I have to say. Ooh, this is big. This is actually big. So let people know if you run into folks who have taken out student loans, let people know the following thing. Under the CARES Act, which was the first stimulus bill, it became illegal for the government to garnish wages to pay student loans. Okay, so as it was before, if you had taken out federal loans, the government could garnish your wages to pay interest and principal on those loans. The CARES Act made that illegal. However, and this is true, Betsy DeVos's Department of Education has been illegally ignoring that facet of the stimulus bill. In fact, they've continued to garnish the wages of 54,000 individuals, making up an entire 1/8 of all people who owe the government student loans. Now, putting aside the fact that the student loan market is usurious and the fact that education should be accessible and affordable, or hell, maybe even free, it is absolutely beyond the pale that Betsy DeVos would continue to garnish wages after it was made explicitly illegal. Now, we don't have any information about who these 54,000 people are, but it's just a prodigious number. Literally, it's 1/8 of all the outstanding loans. And anyway, there's a lawsuit against her department, and God willing, they're going to lose, and the government's going to have to pay these folks' monies back with interest. And I guess penalties, because interest for the 2 months in which they've continued to collect is probably not that high, but some form of penalty on the government. Although, how often does that happen? If you're Mike Flynn, never, which I will not get into. Yesterday, we did a whole rundown of how the Mike Flynn case stacks up, the arguments that the Justice Department has for dismissing it, and why those arguments are total nonsense. But I really want to encourage people, I posted on my Facebook, I really want to encourage people to check out Legal Eagle's video on it. It's 40 minutes long. Just watch it at 2x speed or 1.5x speed. But it really goes into why it is completely unprecedented and irresponsible for the Department of Justice to move to dismiss Michael Flynn's case. Just mind-boggling. But if you thought that was mind-boggling, you might have heard about Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo and the Inspector General that he dismissed. Now, the other day, we mentioned that the investigation the IG apparently undertook was about misuse of government staffers. Actually, I think I forgot to mention this the other day. Okay, so the other day, we learned that Mike Pompeo was under investigation for misuse of government staffers. Now, you might say, oh, that doesn't sound so bad, but I just really want to be clear about this. Before we get to the bombshell that came out today, I just want to be clear. Every time you say something, every time you hear something like Mike Pompeo misused staff, which are, taxpayer-funded employees of the federal government hired to do a specific job for the State Department, when you hear that he misused them to pick up his dry cleaning or walk his dog, and you say that doesn't seem like a very big deal, that only goes to show how incredibly far we've come under one of the most corrupt regimes ever, possibly the most corrupt regime ever to govern this country. There was, Grant out there, Teapot Dome scandal, all that, and Andrew Jackson wasn't great either. But that being said, Trump has really started to set some standards here, because people are just saying, So what? This guy just misused an employee. This would have been a scandal for any other presidential administration. And the IG properly investigated this. And it is a huge problem to treat federal employees on the public dime as if they're your personal servants. I just want to put this in perspective. The comptroller of New York State, before Tom DiNapoli, I want to say it was Alan Hevesi, but I don't want to besmirch a good man's name if it wasn't Alan Hevesi. But the comptroller before Tom DiNapoli was booted out of office because of a scandal involving his use of a government employee, I believe in this case a state trooper, to chauffeur his wife. You're not supposed to use government resources for your own personal benefit or your own personal gain. And if at any point you say that doesn't sound like a big deal, it only goes to show how far we've come. You can hire your own personal assistant. A lot of these folks, have staff. Well, actually, you're not supposed to use any government employees for personal stuff. So, you can hire your own personal assistant, outside of your government work. You pay them, but this should be a scandal, but it's not. So, how do we get to a real scandal that rocks even this administration? The Inspector General was apparently also investigating Mike Pompeo for the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. Now, how do we end up with sales of arms to Saudi Arabia being the thing? You might remember that back in 2019, Trump issued an emergency declaration citing Iran to avoid congressional oversight of the sale of $8 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. If you don't remember that, you might remember the pictures that were taken of Donald Trump with a representative of Saudi Arabia. I think it might have been MBS, the prince. You might remember a picture of him with a representative from Saudi Arabia holding up a picture of a plane, right? He had a picture of all of these military things, and he really fixated on the plane. It was like, look how cool our planes are. We're selling them so much stuff. We have a very strong relationship with Saudi Arabia. They're our best clients or whatever. And he said something to that effect. And it's because we were selling them $8 billion worth of military hardware. Now, yeah, go look it up. It's great. In any event, Congress normally has the authority to approve or disapprove of sale of arms to foreign countries. However, Donald Trump issued this emergency order allowing the State Department to bypass congressional approval and make the sale. At the time, Congress was already upset. And the Inspector General was asked to look into the legitimacy of that emergency order by the House Congressional Foreign Relations Committee. For doing this, apparently, the Inspector General has now just started this investigation. In doing this, Mike Pompeo went to Donald Trump and asked him, or suggested, I should say, that the Inspector General be fired, to which Trump agreed and then fired the Inspector General. Now, a few things about this. One, the opposition to the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia was actually bipartisan. The firing of the IG is actually unpopular both amongst Democrats and Republicans. The House is obviously livid, partisan components to that because it's Democratic. The Senate, controlled by the Republicans, Mitt Romney, who has been a vocal critic of the president, said outright that this was an attack on democratic institutions and the accountability of the executive. Chuck Grassley, who chairs the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, a very high-ranking Republican, said that the president's rationale for dismissing the IG wasn't sufficient. So when the president dismisses an inspector general, if a president dismisses an inspector general, I should say, they're required to give Congress a rationale for doing so. Donald Trump's rationale was simply a lack of confidence in the IG. And in fact, in a quote, which the Washington Post has teased from an interview with Mike Pompeo, Pompeo basically said, and you can look this up, it's on my Facebook, but Pompeo basically said, We couldn't get the IG to investigate things in the manner we wanted him to, which is kind of mind-blowing because it's basically an admission that the Inspector General was investigating the executive branch, and they didn't want the Inspector General to do an investigation that was independent of the executive, right? I mean, the entire objective of an Inspector General is to independently look into matters of concern without interference from the people they're investigating. And yet, Pompeo's criticism of the Inspector General was that he wasn't doing it in accordance with the way the White House wanted him to. So, this thing, we're going to see how far this goes, but it is just so, even though I would say many of us would argue that the mask had been pulled back a long, long time ago, the brazenness as we approach November in how the Trump administration is treating the rule of law and is treating the oversight mechanisms of our democracy is just absolutely incredible. It is so in your face. It is so obvious as to not be believed. You have a Justice Department which is attempting to dismiss a case in which the defendant pled guilty twice. You have an Inspector General looking into a misuse of executive power in the sale of military arms, dismissed just as that investigation is getting underway. You have an Inspector General appointed by all the other Inspector Generals, overseeing the largest single expenditure of the US government, I think in history, the $2 trillion CARES Act, dismissed as well by the president and replaced. Well, I'm unfamiliar with the mechanism by which that Inspector General was replaced, but I believe just appointment of the president. It's the cronyism and the insulation of the White House is absolutely ludicrous. And what happens in the Supreme Court regarding the question of the president's taxes is going to really fundamentally set a new, well, we'll see what they decide, but is the capacity to set a new level of executive privilege and immunity from the law. All of these things taken together are really on the verge of creating a completely insular White House. Now, just to the Mike Flynn matter, I think it is important to recognize exactly what that judge is doing. So, Judge Sullivan, who is presiding over the Flynn case, again, which the DOJ is deciding or making an attempt to dismiss, has asked for amicus briefs and has appointed an amicus curiae. Now, I really want you to understand what this means. And again, go look up Legal Eagle's video on the subject matter because it is thorough, going all the way back to the initial FBI investigation. But it is really important to know how seriously this federal judge is taking the matter and why it is so important that we have federal judges that are nonpartisan and independent of the executive. And again, Donald Trump has appointed more federal judges than pretty much any other president in history because of the vacancies left by Barack Obama. And again, those vacancies were vacant because the Senate refused to, the Senate under Mitch McConnell refused to fill any vacancies that Barack Obama appointed. But that aside, what this judge is doing, what Judge Sullivan is doing, is basically saying, DOJ, you want to dismiss the case. Okay. Mike Flynn, you also want to dismiss the case. There is nobody now arguing that the case should not be dismissed. So I am going to invite the opinion of third parties to argue that where the Department of Justice should be arguing it. In addition, because that's not enough, I'm going to appoint an amicus curiae, an actual former prosecutor and former judge to act as a magistrate, which is to say, basically an administrative judge who operates under orders of an appointed federal judge. I'm going to appoint somebody to actually do the work, not just the amicus briefs, but to whose job it will be to do the work of making the case that Flynn's situation should not be dismissed, and to make another determination, and this is, I think, the biggest one, make another determination that Mike Flynn saying now that he is not pleading guilty, that he never lied to the FBI, making a determination whether, because he's making that statement now, he is perjuring himself. So just to be clear, Mike Flynn, again, pled guilty twice to lying to the FBI. He is now saying, dismiss the case, I never lied to the FBI. And the Department of Justice is saying, hey, we can't prove that he lied to the FBI. You should dismiss the case. So the judge has appointed somebody to say, should I dismiss the case? And by the way, regardless of whether or not I should dismiss this case, is Mike Flynn lying? Make a determination. Is Mike Flynn lying about whether or not he lied to the FBI? Because if he's taking back his statement, his guilty plea, that he did lie to the FBI, and he's lying about that, he's perjuring himself. And he needs to go to jail for it. So the supposition here is that this federal judge is not having what the DOJ is throwing down, and he wants to demonstrate to Mike Flynn that this could get worse. This could get worse. You've pled guilty twice. I could not dismiss your case and find you guilty on both of those charges. And because you're trying to take that back, if I determine that those admissions of guilt were valid, you're trying to take back that guilty plea is a lie under oath, which is perjury. So now I'm going to add perjury on top of your two guilty pleas. Okay, so that's what's happening. This is entirely like this has never happened before. You really don't have the Justice Department dismissing cases where somebody's pled guilty once, let alone twice. But this is really just untrodden territory, and ultimately we'll see whether Sullivan does the case. It's extremely uncommon for the DOJ to drop charges and then for a judge not to let the charges be dropped. In fact, I'm not sure that that's ever happened before, but we'll see what happens. Judge Sullivan is clearly indicating, though, that he is displeased with the situation. So let's just tune in with some of these comments first, and then we'll get to the last piece. Oh, no. Yes, to the last piece, which is really about, if folks remember the Independent Democratic Conference, the IDC, which was defeated, there is actually a resurgence happening, and I want to cover it. But let's do the comments, and then we'll get to that, because this is actually quite important if you care at all about New York State politics. So here we go. And I know there are some New York State folks here, particularly in Brooklyn, by the way. This is going to be real important for Brooklyn. But let's see. Julianne Ballington, I was listening to a history podcast today. They were talking about the historical precedents of economic recovery after the Depressions. They pointed to Germany after both World Wars. It is a consensus that the debt Germany had after World War II led to the rise of Hitler. The economic depression led to a desperation for a leader. Any leader, in my opinion, we would do well to remember this now. We need to keep this in mind. After the COVID crisis, we need to make sure that no country goes into an economic depression. Economic stability is a matter of national security. Just so that you know, we are already in a depression. Julianne Ballington, this is an impression of Cuomo. It's really good. Okay, link in the comments. Ellie Martinez, DeVos is a disgusting individual. She is greedy beyond any possible understanding. I'm very much inclined to agree with you. And for folks who missed the part on the Department of Education and Betsy DeVos, I will recap it because I want people to know how they are protected from the Department of Education. How they're protected from having to pay from wage garnishment in the repayment of student loans. So in the stimulus bill, the CARES Act, wage garnishment for people who have federal student loans was banned. However, Betsy DeVos's Department of Education has ignored that law and has continued to garnish the wages of some 54,000 individuals. That is an eighth of all people who owe federal loans. which means that if you know somebody who owes federal loans, there is a relatively good chance that they have illegally had their wages garnished. There was a lawsuit about this, and so folks should look into that. Maybe I'll try to get information about whether it's a class action suit or how that works. But you should know that it is illegal for the federal government to garnish your wages for the repayment of student loan at this time. Okay, on to the further comments. Julianne Ballington says, whoa, there's a whole link there. There is no evidence that hydroxychloroquine can work as a prophylactic or a treatment. Well, I'm adding as a treatment. She says prophylactic, but also no, as a treatment. It's terrible that Trump would say this, i.e. that he is taking hydroxychloroquine prophylactically. That is to say, preventatively. There is some evidence that it can work as a treatment according to an observational study by NYU. I don't care about observational studies. I care about trial studies. And we've been over this like a billion times. Whatever. Deidre Levy. Hevesy did use a state driver for his wife, but he was sentenced to prison for a corruption scheme with the New York State Pension Fund. And there you have it. So it is Hevesy who had the scandal with his wife and the state trooper driving her around. But apparently he was sentenced to prison for corruption within the pension system, which the comptroller controls. Hence the name comptroller, which I believe is actually pronounced controller, but I don't care. There's a P in there. We should pronounce it how it is spelled so that people know the difference. In any event, thank you for that update, Deirdre. Dorian Key, I'm here. Thank you, Dorian, for letting me know. Let's see. Dorian also says, walks in disheveled with messy hair. Luckily, this isn't a room, and I can't see you. Would you like me to bring you on screen, though? Ellie Martinez, how is it that the president can claim something as an emergency, give an emergency order, and be allowed to bypass Congress just like that? Oh, yeah, great question. To declare something an emergency, shouldn't it have clear, specific definitions of such? All of that is beyond me. He's getting away with a lot of nonsense through, quote, emergency. That is absolutely true. And the answer to your question is really that somebody has to challenge him. And nobody challenged him at the time. It's sort of the same deal with his misappropriation of border wall funds. Politically speaking, you have to pick and choose your battles. But because the president is constantly declaring emergencies, he sort of just gets away with it. In this moment, however, because of this IG, and so in response to his emergency declaration, Eliot Engel, who's chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, I believe, asked the Inspector General to look into this emergency declaration and the State Department's sale of $8 billion worth of military hardware to Saudi Arabia. So that was the response, to ask the IG to begin an investigation. Once that investigation got going, you can see the result, which is the firing of that Inspector General. So the checks and balances of our government are just falling apart or being undermined before our very eyes. We will see what falling apart means, or whether we achieve a state of having fallen apart, based on what the Republicans do in response to this firing of the IG. If they go along with it and they allow Trump to unilaterally declare this emergency and to bypass Congress's approval, then we're going to see yet further erosion of what has been a very honestly steady decline under multiple presidents of the authority of the legislature. You might recall that in many, many situations, the legislature has ceded authority to the executive in really ongoing and long-term ways, which has stripped the legislature of some of its greatest powers. The ability to declare war, for example, you have the War Powers Act, you have massive surveillance under the Patriot Act. In fact, there's a huge effort to fight the renewal of FISA as it stands because of a component which would allow browser search history without a warrant. And the logic behind this is basically they can get, there was a provision in the Patriot Act to allow them to see what library books you check out, which that is just disgusting. That's so gross. And this is an extension of that to the digital world now that people are no longer going out and leaving the same trail in the physical world that they used to. Anyway, there's a huge effort by privacy advocates to get that taken out of the new FISA bill. But it just goes to show the degree to which Congress has historically been willing to cede power to the executive branch. Dorian Key, are we getting more Magna Carta tonight? For folks who tuned in yesterday, I did read a section of the Magna Carta per request yesterday, and I guess I'll read one more section. It's part of our ongoing series of where did the Constitution come from? And the Magna Carta is a really important primary influence. Okay, so, Peng Huang. In real estate, when a homeowner foreclosed on a house, some will pour cement in the toilet to destroy the plumbing system. That's so funny. What prevents Trump from, quote, pouring cement in the toilet to destroy the plumbing system? What prevents Trump from, quote, pouring cement in the pipes should he lose this November? Nothing. And he's the kind of spiteful asshole who would do it. Well, I suppose the only thing that prevents Trump from pouring cement into the pipes, and it really depends on how you look at it, is the other branches of government and the independence of the civil service. So the civil service is the civil service because back in the day, when all government employees were appointments, things got really corrupt really fast. The spoils system, you might remember, or not, whatever, was invented by Andrew Jackson, and it was his idea that, hey, if you win an election, you have the right to fire everybody you don't like and hire everybody you do like, because that's what winning an election means, power. In the Reform era, and go read Plunkett of Tammany Hall, New York was a great test case, like a model case for this, rather. In the Reform era, it was argued that civil servants should be created. And I want it to be clear, this idea of civil servant that we have today, it's not old. It's fairly new. Civil servants were people who were appointed or hired to fill government jobs, but were done in a way that was independent of the politicians, primarily through passing a civil service exam, which did not discriminate based on political party or who you knew, et cetera, et cetera. Then these lifers or these civil servants could not be fired by politicians except in specific cases of incompetence or corruption or what have you. So the biggest thing preventing any individual president or politician generally from putting cement into the pipes is the civil service, which still you take a civil service exam to qualify. That being said, in a lot of ways, Trump has already poured cement into the pipes. He has undermined the rule of law. He has undermined the independence of the judiciary. He has undermined the credibility and impartiality of the Department of Justice. He has stripped the State Department of its diplomats and its capacity to conduct foreign relations. So insofar as hobbling the United States and its political infrastructure, he has already done a tremendous job. What more he could do to poison the well? I mean, there's a lot, admittedly. He still has a tremendous amount of power, and if he loses the election, he will still have a good month and a half to 2 months to ruin shit, even start a nuclear war if he wants, before the next president assumes office in January. Who knows what he's going to do or what will happen. But our defense against that is a Democratic Congress, ideally in November, a Democratic Senate, and as of right now, a judiciary that is not entirely stacked with Trump appointees. And one of the reasons we really need to take the Senate is so that they don't just ram through a billion trillion judges in the last days of the Trump administration. However, again, it is entirely possible, even though they would be a lame duck Senate, that term doesn't really exist, but even though they would have no legitimacy to do it, even if the Republicans lost control of the Senate and the White House, they would still have control of those branches of government for a month to 2 months, where they could theoretically ram through a bunch of stuff, even if they lost the election. Very dangerous. Sort of uncommon for, well, it's not uncommon for that to happen. It's also when the president does all of their pardons, but so there's a lot that could be done to sort of pour cement in the pipes. those are our protections. And again, the civil service being a big one. Julianne, there have been no large clinical trials of hydroxychloroquine. All have been too small or observational studies. I'm not for or against. There have just been no large clinical trials. All the studies for and against hydroxychloroquine have been up. Yes. Chris Barron, they do. But who does? If you could put that reference, that'd be great. Dorian Key, can we arrest him for tax fraud? If the president is found guilty of tax fraud, like we get his tax receipts, you can't actually, I'm pretty sure you cannot arrest a sitting president. You might be able to try them for criminal, actually you can. No. Even Bill Clinton wasn't tried for, he wasn't tried in criminal court. You can't try a sitting president. I think you should be able to, Really what happens is you reveal a criminal matter. I think the court can hear it. Even if the president's convicted, you can't sentence a sitting president. That happens after they leave office. But this would be a matter for the House to then impeach. Chris Barron, they do not give civil service exams for federal jobs. There is a foreign service exam. I don't know what other exams might exist, but certainly for some jobs, you do take an exam to become a lifer. For others, I guess I don't know the answer. Certainly not for all jobs. You can just apply for a job. But then many of the people making the hiring decisions are themselves civil servants, protected from undue influence by the politicians. Dorian, if Trump wins re-election, but the Dems take the Senate, do you think we will impeach him again? Okay, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, so if Trump starts if Trump starts pouring cement into the pipes, as Peng mentioned, that would be the thing to do, to immediately impeach after he's lost the election, even though he's leaving in 2 months. But that's only if you take the Senate. That's only if you take the Senate. No, I'm sorry, you can't. You can't do that because the new Senate isn't sworn in until afterward, until January, until the new year. So, yeah, no, you're screwed. Deidre Levy, teachers don't take civil service exams. They just take other tests. Yes, teachers need masters in education, and hiring is done there by principals and what have you. But the mayor doesn't directly hire every individual teacher. And there's like standards for hiring them. Really, the civil service exam and the civil service stuff is for direct appointees, direct bureaucrats of the executive branch. Okay. Dorian Key. No, as in Trump wins second term, but the Dems take both houses. Oh, will they impeach him? That's quite dangerous. And I think it really depends on what he does. I think it really depends on what happens. I doubt it would be the go-to move. I do doubt it would be the go-to move. Deirdre Levy. Oh, yes. Teachers are public servants, not civil servants. Right. Dorian Key. Then we impeach after the new Senate. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I don't think that would be the first thing that a Democratic Congress does. They'd probably try to exercise a lot of their legislative agenda, and they would wait for Donald Trump to get in the way before impeaching him. They would need better pretense, or they would need new, I think, pretense for the impeachment. They couldn't just go off of what they were doing before. It would seem too partisan, too sort of like failed before, even though you had this Republican Congress. But double jeopardy, even though it doesn't apply to impeachments, just doesn't really sit well with folks, I don't think. I don't think you want to go and try and rehash the same thing you did before. You want to try and find something. It failed before. You want to try to find something with more solid ground if you possibly can. Peng, ain't it a matter of national security that our number one media, Fox and New York Post, are owned by a foreigner and by a single person? And there's Sinclair Media out there. But, I would argue probably yes. But because of the First Amendment, it's generally unlikely for So Congress actually doesn't have the capacity. I don't know what would happen in that regard. In many cases, for industries that are important to national security, Congress can prevent mergers and do all sorts of things. I don't actually know if it can do that for the press because of the First Amendment, which bars Congress from interfering with the establishment of press organizations. That's really interesting. I would argue that there maybe is an argument there that, say, Russia came in and just started pumping money into Russia Today and set up shop in the United States, and they became the largest media outlet in the United States. That is definitely a security threat. And does the Congress have the power to abridge the freedom of that press because it's viewed as a foreign agent? I would say maybe you might be able to make that case, but I think it'd be a very difficult one to make. And I think that the way Rupert Murdoch runs Fox News, it would be hard. And the New York Post, I think it'd be hard to get the courts to somehow restrict those outlets, particularly because they also run like local affiliates, which are not like the national brands. Like the Post being as a local, but like the local Fox affiliates are not like national Fox News. Dorian Key, we have so much on him, being Trump. It should be the first thing on the agenda. The election will be a referendum on Trump. If he holds the White House but loses the Senate, I just don't think that impeachment will be first on the docket for a Democratic Congress that did not succeed in winning the White House. I'm not saying it's off the table. I just think that the first thing they'll try to do is make the case that they have a political mandate to pass legislation that Americans voted for to do that, and then they'll try to constrain Trump and try to force his hand on some things. And when he operates in a way that's contradictory to that's a violation of separation of powers, they'll try to nail him on that, if it gets to that. Dorian Key, why not we won? You're posing a situation to me where we win 2 chambers of Congress, but do not win the White House. So by definition, we lost the White House. Salim Munzi, vote people, please vote. You heard it here first. Vote. Oh, actually, never mind. You need a supermajority to impeach. Yeah, totally screwed. F this presidential system. It does have its detractions. And there is a reason that the United States, when exporting democracy, never exports the presidential model that we use. It always exports a parliamentary system of proportional representation. True story. I mean, we did try to export the presidential system, particularly Latin America. And after we saw that it almost always devolved, I think always, I don't think there's a successful case of a presidential system like the United States, except the United States. Every time we've exported it, it has always, at some point or another, devolved into a coup or gridlock that has resulted in a dictatorship. So, yeah, it's not a great system. It just works because of the cultural context of the United States that grew up with it and built a democracy to coincide and happened to end up being leaders of the free world. Pen Huang, who do you think wins this November? Very tough call, honestly. Very tough call. Extremely hard. I don't know. I don't know who will win this November. I think the Democrats really do have a shot. I think that Trump has the power of incumbency, a very rabid fan base, and a base in the right places. I think that the longer this coronavirus thing goes on and the more people die, old people who tend to back Trump will either die at higher rates or they will, or they'll flip because they're the most at risk and they will feel that. But I really do think that at this moment it's anyone's game, and we really have to double down and make the argument that people should be voting, and they should be voting, obviously, for somebody who's not Donald Trump. I will take that back. They should be voting for the Democratic nominee, whoever that is, because voting for somebody who's not Donald Trump isn't good enough in this case. You need the votes. You need the Electoral College wins. You need to understand that in 2016, Donald Trump won by a very, very slim margin, something like 80,000 votes across 3 states. That was it. It's incredibly razor thin. That is such a small number of votes. It looks large in the Electoral College because for some dumbass reason, we apportion the Electoral College votes in a majoritarian system by states. So that if you win one more vote than your opponent, in a state, you get all of those electoral college votes. So it looks like a landslide in the electoral college on the map, but in reality, Donald Trump won by a hair's breadth across a few swing states. And we need to make that up. And it is not enough to say vote for somebody who's not Donald Trump. You have to say vote for the Democratic nominee if you don't want Donald Trump in office. And I don't. So I'm going to say that regardless of the reservations that I have about who I suspect will be the Democratic nominee. But that being said, I don't think there's a way to tell who's going to win in November right now. And more than voting, if you have it in you to help out, to make phone calls and donate money for whoever the Democratic presidential nominee is, particularly into battleground states, where we could also flip a Senate seat, do it. Do it. Fight for the U.S. Senate, fight for the White House. They dovetail onto each other. And while you're at it, fight for congressional seats, because we cannot have Congress flipping. If Republicans take control of Congress as well as the White House, oh my God, I don't even know. And the Republicans are launching, it was in the news today, major efforts to suppress the vote. Big efforts to prevent people from voting and participating, which of course is their modus operandi. This is just so important to be engaged this cycle. And I don't just mean vote, although you must vote, to do what you can to win your congressional races, to win your Senate races, and to win the White House. And I'm the first person to say, don't focus on the feds, focus on local. Don't. I mean, there's overlap, and you should try to overlap as much as possible, but you can't mess around. For the first time, maybe in my life, the federal election is the most important one. When people say the federal government, your local government impacts your life more than the federal government, not this time. Not this time. So if you can do more than just vote, do it. Again, money, volunteer, sign up. Whoever ends up being the nominee, find a Senate race that is flippable that you want to help in, get involved. Okay. Last thing I wanted to mention, because I promised I would, and because it's important. For folks who don't know about the Independent Democratic Conference, or the IDC was a bunch of Democrats who up until 2018 caucused with Republicans in the New York State Senate, handing control of the state Senate to Republicans, even though Democrats had a majority of the senators. This would be as if the United States Senate had more Democrats than Republicans, but a number of Democrats, in exchange for committee chairships and bigger salaries, moved over to caucus with the Republicans, but continued to run as Democrats so that voters thought that they were voting for Democratic leadership. It was a big lie. It stymied a lot of progress here in New York State. And in 2018, because Donald Trump was elected to president, enough people were paying attention that we could vote them all out. Now, in Brooklyn, the Democratic Party machine is making big moves to assert its power over its representatives. And if you ever watched a political drama, you know that the best way to assert your power over somebody else is to take somebody who's compromised and put them into office. Why? Because then they owe you. They know they have no base of their own, and that at any moment they could be thrown out. IDC member Jesse Hamilton was ejected. Sorry, ejected implies that he did something wrong and his colleagues threw him out. Senator Jesse Hamilton lost his re-election bid for being in the IDC. Again, running as a Democrat, saying he was a Democrat, and voting with Republicans. The Kings County, Brooklyn County machine is running him for state assembly against a very outspoken progressive, Diana Richardson. Diana Richardson is a Working Families Party person, not a Democrat. She got into her assembly seat when the inept Democratic machine in her district failed to file a candidate because they forgot about the deadline. This was in a special election. Now, this is not me saying the WFP is great. The WFP is its own machine. And it's not good, in my opinion. But it's a lot better than the Brooklyn Democratic Party machine, I'll say that much. So Diana Richardson is facing, and I think she's pretty good. You know, I don't have any real qualms with her. But she is facing a challenge from somebody who is bad, demonstrably bad, because the Brooklyn County or Kings County machine wants to control that area, and they cannot control Richardson, who does not owe anything to the county party apparatus. Again, she won herself in a special election on the Working Families Party line and doesn't owe any favors to the Brooklyn County leader or the Brooklyn County political structure of the Democratic Party. I think it's really a disgusting turn that the new county leader of Brooklyn, Rodneyse Bichat, who's in the assembly, would run somebody against her colleague, particularly somebody who basically was a Republican, who the voters rejected for behaving like a Republican in an attempt to unseat somebody who has apparently, or by all metrics, done a good job of representing her district. I think it's very important for people to see how these things happen, to see what's going on in Brooklyn, which is the resurgence of the political machine. The machine was, I believe, on its back foot. Frank Seddio stepped down as chair, and there is a theory that Frank Seddio, white man, stepped down because New Kings Democrat was making great inroads into New Kings Democrats, along with some other progressive and reform organizations, were making great inroads into the county committee process and into the county party structure. But they were running into trouble in communities of color because even though NKD had at the time a black president, it was still seen as very gentrifier and very white. And so by removing Frank Seddio from leadership and installing Rodneyse Bichat, who is a black woman, Haitian, I believe. Well, I don't want to, yeah, I'm pretty sure she's Haitian, that they would make it very difficult for New Kings Democrats and other reform groups to target her as corrupt or target her as a boss. But she is, and we've spoken about some of the things that have happened in Brooklyn, folks that I know who have been removed from the ballot. We spoke about how the county party really went out of their way and challenged a lot of people, even during the pandemic, and kicked a lot of challengers off the ballot for city council and for district leader, a lot of reformers, a lot of progressives. We've spoken about this, and it's very clear that the current county leadership has decided that it wants to exercise its power and flex its muscles. Removing a representative who's not beholden to the county structure and putting somebody in who was in the IDC is a perfect example of how these machines work, of how they'd rather corral power and centralize it than find good candidates to represent neighborhoods, even candidates who are willing to stand up for principles and be good Democrats. Again, Jesse Hamilton was in the IDC. He betrayed the Democrats to give control of the state Senate to Republicans. And now the Kings County Democratic Party is putting him up against a progressive assemblywoman who has voted, with the Democrats in the assembly time and time again. Even though she owes nothing to that party, we are ideologically on the same page. So I urge you, check out Diana Richardson. If you can give her a small donation, please do so. And let me know if you do so that I can say, hey, I sent you some money. But, if you can do this, please do, because it's very important that we demonstrate to the county machine that we not be taken in, and that just because we're focused on Washington, we're not incapable of understanding that people are using Trumpian tactics right here in New York to build power and create political dynasties, just like Trump is trying to do at the federal level. So with that, I'll probably touch on that again sometime in the future. But for the moment, we're going to call it a night. Thank you all so much for tuning in. There's a few comments. Let's see if there's anything new. Ooh, let's see. What do you make of the pro? Buttons. There we go. What do you make of the pro-Bernie people and pro-Trump people who have united to hate Biden? Do you think this is an argument that the extremist mentality is driving both parties is similar? Also, do you think that both the pro-Bernie people and pro-Trump people tend to be more privileged, therefore do not understand how others have been harmed by Trump? Pro-Bernie and pro-Trump people that have united against Biden. I think that there's a lot of reasons not to like Biden. I furthermore think that Bernie people who don't support Biden are going against their own interests, and Bernie has basically said as much. So are they extremists? You know, it really, you know, we see a lot of this because we're in New York, and in New York, people feel very privileged because it doesn't matter how they vote. The Electoral College votes in New York are not going to go to Republican, basically. It's very difficult to say whether somebody's an extremist unless they live in a swing state and refuse to vote for the Democratic nominee. I would like for everybody to vote for the Democratic nominee, regardless of where they live, regardless of whether it's a swing state or not, because we want that popular vote, not because it makes a difference in terms of who wins, but because it is an important metric by which we gauge our democracy, and people understand this intrinsically. But that being said, I don't necessarily think that they tend to be more privileged. I think there's a lot of pro-Trump people who are not privileged. I think there's a lot of pro-Bernie people who are also not privileged. They feel very strongly about the fact that Joe Biden is a continuation of the neoliberal philosophy, which has done them dirty over the last 20, 25 years. So I think it's very hard to make sort of these blanket assertions about why one group of people support a candidate over another. And I try not to do that because the more you do it, the harder it becomes to build bridges and really understand voters as people and encourage them to take an action you want them to take. As you know, I teach in the Organizing 101 workshops that listening is its own form of persuasion. And that's because one, if you don't listen, it's difficult to persuade because you don't know what the other person is thinking or feeling. But listening to somebody is half the battle. When people don't think you're listening to them, they're not inclined to listen to you. And so I don't want to call these folks extremists. There are certainly extremists out there. There are people who will not change their minds regardless of what data you put in front of them and will just shut you out. But I don't want to say anything about their relative privilege because I don't know the answers to each individual person. I know people who are privileged who support Trump. I know people who are privileged who support Biden. And I know the reverse. Now, there is certainly the case that a lot of people feel like they're marginalized, particularly those who support Trump, who are not marginalized. They think that they're victims, but they are mainly in positions of power relative to others. This is a problem, this perceived victimization and marginalization. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are actually in those positions who support Trump because they do view themselves rightly as having been left behind by a certain set of policies which were espoused both by Republicans and Democrats. And really the thing to understand about Trump is he doesn't fit into the previous paradigms of neoliberal or neoconservative or liberal and conservative or any of that. He is a populist. He is a conservative populist. And that is a different flavor that appeals to a different constellation of voters. And, Clinton advisor or whatever recently said that the political map has shifted for the first time since 1992. And I would believe that. I would agree with that. And, it sort of just speaks to the different types of people who now support Donald Trump as a candidate. And Bernie Sanders. Julianne, I think I misspelled a lot of words. I'm trying to do too much at once. That's okay. It didn't seem to interfere with reading it. We know that the Kings County leader has no morals or loyalty. She keeps proving that again and again. I couldn't say. She's certainly loyal to her family. Why would the chair, Deirdre Levy, why would the chair want to support Hamilton instead of an assembly member? Because power. Because Jesse Hamilton lost his last election to the state senate. If the county can install him in the assembly, he will owe county a lot. He will owe county his seat. He will know that he did not win that seat by himself, and he will do what county says. And that increases the power of the person who put him there, which is the county leader. So it's all about control. And also about punishing your enemies. So somebody who is not towed the party line, like Diane Richardson, will then be punished. And the fact that county can install somebody like Jesse Hamilton over an assemblywoman like Diane Richardson isn't just about getting that one vote, which is a display of power. It is also about sending the message that look what I can do. Look who I can take out, and look who I can put into office. You will be next if you challenge me. So it creates a culture of fear. Deirdre Levy goes on, midnight is apparently the donation deadline for assembly members. It is the donation deadline for a filing, but you can continue to donate up until the day of the election. Dorian Key, Magna Carta. Okay, fine. Julianne Ballington, is Bernie a populist? I would argue, not really. He's a democratic socialist. I would say his policies, the policies of democratic socialists, happen to be pretty popular. But he appeals to people on a basis of class differentiation and class economics, which is different from populism, which is just saying things. Well, you know what? I'm going to just look up the definition of populism right now so I can make this distinction. A political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that the concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. So in that regard, Bernie Sanders is a populist, but the policies that he's proposing are ones of class distinction. I don't want to say class warfare, because really a thriving middle class is good for capitalism as a whole. It drives consumerism, and it drives investment, and it drives all these positive things. Bernie Sanders is populist insofar as he hates on the establishment and entrenched special interests, but that is really all of what Donald Trump is. And he doesn't have any real solutions for these problems. His populism is an empty, conservative, rhetorical populism. Whereas Bernie Sanders, while he says things which are populist and talks about the millionaires and the billionaires, his politics is really one of classism and a recognition that working people are not getting a share of the pie commensurate with what it was 20, 30 years ago, and that so much of the wealth generated in the country in the past 25 years has gone disproportionately to a specific type of American. And this is different from just, I would say, sheer populism, which is bashing on the elite, to say there is something we can do about this. It's something that involves all of us. And really, it's not to the exclusion of the elite. There are millionaires and billionaires who support Bernie Sanders in this economic undertaking because of the economic theory. It's not just he's attacking a group that is seen as elite. And the other thing that you can say about Bernie Sanders' populism is that it's not driven by conspiracy theories, because oftentimes the focus of populists on cabals and elites revolves around conspiratorial ideas of who is the elite so that you can hate on them without really needing to dive into policy or solutions. So the Jews, the deep state, the Clintons, the Democrats, the establishment. That is populism, and it is a very negative force because it pulls people away from caring about the underpinnings of our society and our economics to caring, I don't even want to say caring about, but to focusing and being concerned about the livelihoods of what other people are doing and demonizing people who aren't them. So yeah, I suppose that's what I'd say about, is Bernie Sanders a populist? Tony Marco, you are a great speaker. Thank you, Tony. I appreciate that. If you like what I have to say, please share the live. This is also on YouTube, so I'll put the link down there. People can share the YouTube video if they like. Now, I will read from the Magna Carta as was requested, and we'll see if people stick around for that. Now, just to remind folks of what the Magna Carta is, the Magna Carta is basically Britain's, quote, constitution. Now, it is bullshit because it's not a constitution and can be changed by the Parliament, and really, it's just some guidelines for the way the British monarchy is constrained and rights of the feudal lords. It's not even really about the people. But it's sort of been extended over time, and it is the underpinnings of what make up fair, like what would be considered a distribution of power between Parliament and the king, which really, really did inform the founders of the United States, their ideas of what should be the distribution of power between the legislature, the presidency, and the judiciary. So I got to find the link because I definitely did not plan to do this again tonight, but because Dorian. In any event, I read a piece of the Constitution, the preamble of the Constitution yesterday, and I was thinking about working my way through that, but Dorian requested that I read from the Magna Carta instead, and I think that us reading through the Magna Carta, maybe one clause or one section at a time, will give folks an opportunity to hear about the philosophical underpinnings of our very own democracy. And so here, I guess at the end of every episode now, I'm going to go back to an original primary source text. I think maybe once we're done with this, instead of going to the Constitution, which people are somewhat familiar with, maybe we'll go to the Federalist Papers. But let's start with the Magna Carta, the document that kicked it all off. So yesterday, we read the first 3 paragraphs. It was basically 2 paragraphs of a lot of names. Here's a bunch of people involved in this thing. The founders, at least, had the good graces to put all their names at the fucking end. But whatever. The folks, the lords and whatever, and the bishops all felt they had to be at the beginning of the Magna Carta. Then we spoke about the first piece of the Magna Carta, which was about the freedom of the church. And it is basically the exact opposite of the First Amendment here in the United States, establishing the Church of England as its own entity, which shall have its own rights. So, yeah. The beginning of the Magna Carta is the opposition position to the First Amendment. Let's proceed on to number 2. So, again, I'm going to read the first sentence of that first section just so we can have some parallelism. 1, first, that we have granted to God. So these are the rights of God in the Magna Carta. Then the next section is, after God, to all free men of our kingdom, we have also granted, for us and our heirs forever, all the liberties written out below, to have and to keep for them and theirs, to have and to keep for them and their heirs, for us and our heirs. If any earl, baron, or other person that holds lands directly of the crown for military service shall die, and at his death his heir shall be of full age and owe a relief, the heir shall have his inheritance on payment of the ancient scale of relief. That is to say, the heir or heirs of an earl shall pay £100 for the entire earl's barony, the heir or heirs of a knight 100s. I don't even know what that means. At most, for the entire knight's fee, and any man that owes less shall pay less in accordance with the ancient usage of fees. The hell? Anybody? So, first I will say that this Magna Carta is translated from Latin. Apparently well, because this is on the British Library's website. I'm going to try and interpret this the best as I can, understanding that I am much more attuned to constitutional precepts and language. But it basically looks like if you are an earl or a baron, so basically earls and barons receive their land from the crown. The king or queen would bestow an earl or a baron land. in this case in particular, in exchange for military service. So if this person dies, then their heirs shall be able to inherit that that land, paying the monarch whatever is put out in this schedule of relief, which I guess is to say some degree of inheritance tax. And that inheritance tax looks like £100 for an entire earl's barony, or the heir of an heir, or like I don't know what this means, the heir or heirs of a knight 100s, but whatever, who cares? The point being that you're entitled to your property, and the monarch. Oh, hey, if I'm reading this right, this is actually quite big. It basically says the monarch can't just take your shit. Your family is entitled to the inheritance of your lands granted to you by the crown, so long as you pay the estate tax. And that is actually very big, because one of the most, I went to London School of Economics for a time, and the big question is, why did Europe industrialize and not China, which was technologically more advanced at the time, and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, a lot of thought goes into why did Europe industrialize? And in particular, why did England, which was this freaking island off the coast? And one of the big, big reasons put forward is the private property rights that were granted to the earls and barons in the United Kingdom. And the story goes basically like this. If you're worried that the crown is going to take all your money, you're not going to invest it, because as you invest your money and you get more money, the crown, threatened by your power and jealous of your wealth, will just come and appropriate it. So this language here, which secures for yourself and for your heirs the wealth you have accumulated, so long as you pay a tax, is the first iteration, or first guarantee, I should say, of property rights in the UK, which is a huge step forward in terms of, we might say liberal economics, but I don't mean liberal economics in the term of leftist economics. I mean in liberalism, which revolves around the primacy of the individual and individual rights, and an important component of that is individual property, which ends up feeding the establishment of markets and of capitalism, because now when you make money or you own capital, you are entitled to hold that capital. And when you invest that capital, you can reap the rewards of that investment. And the state, i.e. the king or the monarch or the government, isn't entitled to taking the value that you have generated. And so this spurs participation in markets, and it spurs investment. And so actually, this was a humongous influencer. I mean, we talk about the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in the United States, but the original draft of that was life, liberty, and property. That's what you're entitled to in the United States. But it didn't sound quite nice enough. So Thomas Jefferson came along and changed property to pursuit of happiness. But yeah. So I learned something today, and I hope all of y'all did too. That was very interesting. Tomorrow we'll deal with clauses 3 and 4, because 3 is very short. There you go. Let's see. Dorian Key, wasn't this the 1200s? Yes, I think it was 1217. The date's at the top. 1215. 1215. There is no industrialization until like 600 years later. Yes. The point is that in economic history, in this question of why did Europe industrialize, they're trying to figure out what laid the foundation for the investment in new technologies and industrialization. And a big component of this is this wasn't enough, but this is a foundational concept in the idea that the monarch can't appropriate your wealth. And so this led over time to more investment and more participation in market economics, which are then tied to industrialization, than in other parts of the world where the monarch or emperor could appropriate wealth on a whim. And so this constraining of the monarch led to barons and earls investing in new technologies, because any additional yield that they got could remain theirs and remain their heirs over time, as long as they paid that fee. And so this was a setup for robust investing, and then for robust investing and a mature investment market. When we talk about like Silicon Valley has a mature VC market. This is mature investing market, as in Holland, where they were also very into financial innovation. So that's why investing in the 1200 means building a bigger castle and more serfs. Yes, but as ideas come along for investing, as ideas come along for mechanization or for ways to improve agricultural yield, if you invest in improvement of your land, then you reap the reward of that improvement. Or if somebody, say, for example, wants to run a rail line through your land, you reap the benefit of sponsoring that rail line, because you get to hold on to it, and that line continues to generate revenue off into the future as long as it remains popular. And if you have the first rail line, then you have a competitive advantage, first mover advantage. In any event, not to get too much into the economics, but that is to say that in 1215, they were setting the foundations for this idea of private capital, which is very much linked in economic historian thought to the rise of industrialization and the modern world. In any event, this was fun. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope to see you again tomorrow at 8:30.